Outstanding. Thank you very much for attending my session on facilitation. My name is James. I will be your facilitator slash presenter. Now, let's start with a little bit of why. Why are we here? Why are we having this conversation? We're having this conversation because facilitation as a skill is something I believe will benefit the Jedi immensely. I would even go so far as to say is this is something that you might not use yourself as fellow presenters, but that you may give on to your fellow students. Why do I say that? Because one of the things about facilitating is that it lowers your barrier for entry. In order to be able to present, or in order to be able to present, you have to have a strong degree of expertise. You have to be able to be willing to confront questions, to be challenged. You really have to know what's going on. With facilitating, on the other hand, all you need to be able to do is know when somebody is saying something that's definitely not true. You have to be willing to mute people, and you have to be willing to say, and you have to be willing to not talk. As long as you can do those things, you're going to do great facilitating almost anything. Now, to break that down a little bit, when the first step of anything you're facilitating is going to be the introduction. The introduction is when you basically create the boundaries of your space. Now, to give a little bit more background to dive deeper, one of the things I said earlier regarding how when you're facilitating is that you have to have a mix of a strong ego and a strong sense of humility. Why is that? The reason that is because you have to have enough ego that no matter who a person is, that you need to exert control over your session. On the other hand, you need to be humble enough to accept that if you have a session where you only said 5 words, that is a good job. You did great. Because remember, when you're facilitating, it's not about you presenting and you doing, it's about literally in the definition, facilitating. You're trying to get a productive conversation going with a group of people. So the main thing you need for that are people who are talking or people who have things to say. Now, I know in the Jedi community, it's real hard to find people with strong opinions who are willing to exert them. But I'm confident that if we look, we can probably find a group like that. That was a joke, by the way. Anyhow, so let's get started. Sedanoko, could you unmute, please?
Yes, it's
Perfect.
actually Sedanako.
Sedanoko, thank you so much. Which that's actually the first thing which that's actually a good segue into the first lesson of being a good facilitator. You have to be able to accept feedback graciously and move right along. Now, let's start. One of the things that interests me when I think about being a Jedi, something that I think of more as a noun than a verb than a noun, is mentoring and the passing of knowledge. In my opinion, the passing of knowledge, what's most interesting to me when I think about it is signal clarity, is when we're giving knowledge from one person to another, how can we have the highest degree of fidelity, but also at the same time, do we want perfect fidelity? Do we want to have clones of ourselves? Or is part of the teaching process seeing what people do with that information and, how they make it happen? Um, Senanoko, and again, I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name.
You can say
What are
Seta.
Seta, what are some of your experiences with how people surprise you with what they do with your knowledge?
I actually am more of a facilitator myself, that it's not so much that I impart my knowledge as I try to get people to think about what they're looking at. I do have
Mhm.
some very few and far between things where I'm like, no, you have to take this information in. And Actually, one of the classes is the gunshot, and I did this earlier with a
Hmm.
student. Um, and I've used that one several times since I developed it back in 2011,
Hmm.
2012, somewhere in there. And I like seeing how people open up and start thinking a little bit more about how they approach a problem when they start thinking, oh, maybe I do need to think this through before I go and I do something reckless. So using examples and whatnot that they can tie it into a real world situation has benefited a lot of people, and that's really what I think helps. But most of the time, my questions and what I impart upon people is to get them to actually think about themselves in relationship to a topic or a tenet of the Jedi Compass, to be more specific.
Thank you. So let's pause for a minute. What just happened there? I established the space. I said, this is what we're going to talk about. And I gave some idea of where I would like for it to go. Then I picked someone who I knew was fluent in the topic and would be comfortable speaking about it. And I asked them about it. Then from there, I made sure to give them space that they could hold to formulate their response. This is an important point. I did not do that because of rank, but because that's necessary to get people talking. The one of the big obstacles I find is to remember that sense of equanimity, that you want to make sure to give everyone a space to talk. But at the same token, and this is where it'll slip you up, is one of the types of people that you can see when you're facilitating. I call them usurpers, right? These are people who could be genuine experts in the topic. And in some cases, I've seen people who wanted to present, but they were pushed out of it. And so they are attending something that is being facilitated. And the way you can tell that is that they will want to wrench the metaphorical talking stick out. Like they will want to just talk the entire time. Those are the people that in many cases you can be tactful about it, but if they keep going and you feel that they are depriving other people of the means to speak, you might have to use the mute button. And that's the hardest thing to do as a facilitator is when you hear someone and you're like, well, you're saying good things. It's interesting, but we only have an hour and we want to make sure everyone is heard. So the other type, by the way, and this is why we have this policy, I call them the shrinking violets. Now, these are people who they legitimately have something to say. And if you get them to speak, it would be interesting. But the thing is, for whatever reason, anxiety, shyness, what have you, they just don't speak up. And also, one of the things to be mindful of, though I understand this is a very sensitive topic, is that various isms and privileges and things like that can very much play regarding who steps up to speak and who doesn't. Now, you don't have to make everything about this, but it's important to remember. Like, for example, sometimes if someone is female or a woman, they might have a harder time speaking up. So you may want to try to go out of your way to say, hey, what are your thoughts? What are your opinions? On the other hand, other people, you may know someone who has a particularly strong personality, and you may want to talk to them and say, listen, I understand you're an expert in the topic, you're incredibly accomplished, but we want to have a variety of voices there. If you know somebody like that is going to be there, private off-channel conversations are going to be real useful there. So I'm sounding a lot like a presenter right now. Um, Matt, if you could unmute, please, sir. Perfect. So one of the things I've always been curious about, um, regarding mentorship is When do you think, or what signs do you see in someone that you're teaching or mentoring that they're ready to move on? And what does that mean to you?
I think the main thing that makes me think that it's time that we can move on is basically when they get that quote unquote aha moment. You know,
Hmm.
when they finally get it
Hmm.
and they're just you can tell that they've got it, they can do whatever. Like when in scouting, I'm teaching one of the scouts a knot.
Hmm.
When I can see they can literally do it, you know, with their quote unquote eyes closed, that's when I know it's time to move on.
Hmm. That's an excellent point, and that actually brings up another question. And feel free, anybody who'd like to jump in. Have you ever had a situation when you're mentoring where it seems like the student just isn't getting it? And it's not in the sense that they're being defiant or anything like that, but they just, no matter how many times you do it, it just isn't sinking in. So, and this is for anybody, just whoever unmutes first can talk first. What do you do? What do you do when that happens?
Pressing too hard on that button to get them to understand it and get it is actually going to become a problem in the long run. And
Mhm.
so, at least from my perspective, so in that case, it's something that maybe later we can revisit when they are able to refocus their attention back to something.
Mhm.
Now, it also takes a lot to determine whether or not that key is really as important as I think it is to their
Mhm.
development.
Mhm.
And that would be based a lot on what what that development piece, the objective for that development is.
That totally makes sense. One of the things for me that I find is important is time, time and communication. Like in my experience, when I'm trying to teach somebody and they're just not getting it, after a certain point, I've found you just need to step away for a while. But at the same token, especially once you're past the frustration point, it can be interesting to find out why that is. Because it may be that they have a psychological block, it may be that there's some sort of cognitive issue, so forth and so on. Now, what happened there? Calling on someone else, having them give their thoughts on the matter. By the way, thank you so much. And then throwing it out to everyone. The idea being is that we had someone talk first, someone that I had a feeling would be comfortable speaking and that, would be able to move the discussion forward. And that would be a sort of social signal. So when I say, if anybody else wants to talk, oh, these people can talk. I don't have to be first. And that can encourage people to move forward. Now, another thing to really keep in mind, and this is especially true if you're dealing with audiences that are more prone to anxiety, make sure that you have some sort of communication channel. So that way, if somebody, it's not just that they're a shrinking violet, as much as that they just are having an anxiety problem and just do not want to speak. Make sure that you have an open channel so that you can find that out. Because the best way to kill anything you're facilitating is to try to get somebody to speak when they don't want to. So try your best to include as many people as possible, but you win some, you lose some. But I would also say if you don't have every single person talk at the exact same amount, you didn't necessarily lose because a lot of people will interact with your content in a different way. Some people will just like to see the discussion. Some people will want to be in the middle of it, and people will be in between. Now, there's one thing that might trigger people but it's actually a sign that you're doing well. When you get interrupted, or when people get so excited in the topic that they just unmute and go. Yes, that can present some new challenges, but that shows that people are not just engaged with you, but they're engaged with each other, which goes into another topic, sensitive topics. There are some things that you should be very careful about facilitating. Something about mentors. That was, I think, a really good suggestion because it's something that everyone has a base knowledge of, that they would have an opinion on, but not so much of an opinion that it cannot be changed and that it being doubted will cause conflict. I will leave my audience, you, to think about topics that you would not want to facilitate. But in my experience, a good self-test that I use is if I try to facilitate this topic in an impartial manner, what is the risk that somebody's going to storm out of the room? I'd say if that's a pretty high chance, that's probably not the topic to facilitate. Or if it is something you need to facilitate, you might need another facilitator. Um, some of these topics that overall, anything like political, not be very careful. Anything that involves very strongly held views, tread cautiously. Now, you will have, at least in my experience, a little bit more play in the Jedi community than you might have in other communities, just because there's a high premium on staying calm. And outbursts are perhaps less approved in the Jedi community than in other communities. I think that is I think that's the best way that can be put. So I've said a lot so far, almost just over 20 minutes. Is there anybody, so I know Aether, you're not going to be able to talk, no problem at all. So Sophia, I know you're driving. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, Lady Arashoka or Sarah, do you have any topics regarding mentorship that you would like to discuss? And if not, no problem at all.
Nope, I'm just here to learn. I'm not feeling all that well, and I had a long day, so I'm
Oh,
just here existing.
my condolences. Thank you so much for coming. So you see, again, that's part of it. A big part of facilitating is being able to roll with the punches because you can think you know what somebody's going to say. You can think you know what's about to happen. Sophia,
Yeah. Um, how many would be too many for a mentor to take on at once?
see, that's an excellent question. I would say a big part of it is going to be what you're trying to teach, and also who you are as a teacher. Um, I have seen someone being able to mentor a very vague skill, one person with like about 1,000 people, maybe more. However, that person was the Dalai Lama, and he was doing a empowerment that he's done his entire life. I don't know about you, I couldn't do that. So but if you're trying to teach something like meditation, then I'd say as long as you're good at it, and as long as you can split your attention enough, maybe like 10, 15 people. Now, on the other hand, if you're talking about the one-on-one, if you're talking about what I would call corpus training, meaning you're training someone over a body of material. So, for example, if you're trying to train somebody to be a Jedi Knight, then that's going to be maybe two people, maybe three. But any more than three, it can be very difficult to keep up with unless that is your job. And from my understanding, we are not paying people to be Jedi teachers yet. So, but next thing. So I would say, to answer your question, that the main thing to look at is what you're trying to teach and how deep you need it to go. The more skills that are under the umbrella of your mentorship, the fewer people you can teach. The less you know about it, or the more you know about it, the more people you can teach at the same time. Again, with that hard limit of, if it's something big like knighthood, knighthood, art, history, probably one or two people in a close mentor relationship. Did that answer your question, Sophia? See? And there you go. And again, yeah, it's not a matter of being a master in your topic. It's a matter of knowing enough to be able to answer the high level questions. Now, I'll admit I'm not quite perfect at it, because the next thing I would say is, that's an excellent question, Sophia. Senna, what do you think?
As far as the
As
answer to Sophia's question, or
as
in
far as
another
Sophia's
sense?
question.
Okay. So to that, I do believe that when you're doing one-on-one, it does it depends a lot on what your spoons are and what the student is like. If you have
Mhm.
5 students that are well adjusted and will pick up pretty easily what you're doing, then 5 students is perfectly fine. But if you have one student that has a lot of barriers to push through, you might only have the capacity for one student. So it really depends on where you are in your life, where the students are in theirs. And I mean, like you said, no one's getting paid for this job. So it's not like
Mhm.
it's something that we can turn all of our attention to like a social worker would. Um,
Mhm.
so to that end, the average is that most people will say no more than 3 students, uh, but typically it's about 2 students. So that's really just dependent on what's going on. And when you're in an organization that has very few nights, for example,
Mhm.
and you have a lot of students, it may be more difficult to hammer things down into that. And sometimes you will have to, if you want to get everybody through, you will have to take a hit on quality just so
Mhm.
that you can be there for everybody. So it really depends on a great number of factors.
Thank you. Excellent answer. And that actually goes into another area, attention. One of the things that's important when you're facilitating is attention. And one of the ways that you can make sure that people are focused is try to take note of the people in your, pardon me, try and take note of the people in your session. Some people are going to be more familiar with your topic, and some people are going to be a little bit better at answering on the fly. If you basically ask those people input in regards to what happened, that can help get everyone else a little bit more on their toes, because they may think, if not on a conscious level, on an unconscious one, oh, he called on Senta. He might call on anybody. And that makes it where people will kind of clock in a little more. So and also this is another thing to remember when you're facilitating, is that you have to be able to shift gears quickly and be light on your feet. Because it can go any way. I have been in sessions where I found out that, like, one of my favorite writers was going to be there, and like I knew that like, and so I had to rearrange a major chunk of what I was facilitating because I knew that if I used any example from their books, it would go badly for me. Because no matter how much I know about their books, they wrote them. But that's the type of thing to remember, but which actually segues into another thing. Know your audience. And not just knowing your audience from a high level, like, okay, I'm talking to Jedi. What are Jedi like? How do they interact? Who are they as people? What do they like? What do they not like? Do they have opinions about the sequels? Not only that, but and this is really useful, is knowing the people. Knowing which people have problems with anxiety, knowing which people talk a lot, knowing which people might be a little bit bruised if, depending if you do X, Y, or Z. Now, you might think to yourself, but how can I know that information? Pre-facilitating mingling is so useful. Just going around, hanging out in chat channels, listening more than talking. And this is going to be, and I don't know whether you've noticed, but I have repeated more than once that listening is much more important as a facilitator. Your research is listening. Your execution, if done right, is listening. Some of my favorite and most successful salons, the ones that everybody looked back on and said, wow, this is great. I love this. I said 10 words. That's it. Because everybody knew what was going on. I seeded the topic effectively and who I thought my audience was going to be. And so when they went in, I said, okay, guys, we're talking about gears and steampunk. Go. And then they just went off and they spent the entire hour just talking about, I think gears are this way. I think gears should be this way. Why do you people use gears? Da da da. The entire hour was filled up. I spent most of my time sipping tea like Kermit the Frog. It was great. And which is another thing to remember while you're doing this. Victory for a facilitator looks very different than victory as a presenter. If you're a presenter, honestly, it looks a little bit martial sometimes. You stood in front of everyone. You presented your points. You answered feedback. You confronted opposition. And, and that could be how you describe a successful presentation. On the other hand, what is a successful facilitated presentation look like? You don't talk a lot. Other people talk. If people get so into it that when you're like, listen, I have to go. I haven't eaten in 18 hours. I am hallucinating. Instead of, if they say, oh, okay, and they all get up as a group and move somewhere else and keep doing and just keep facilitating themselves, which is not meant to be as dirty as it sounds, then you're done. Like my personal favorite sessions were ones where they ended up becoming real life friends. Like it hit off an actual honest to goodness intellectual relationship. If that happened, that is the ultimate win. That's like if you're a monster in a haunted house and you made somebody faint. That's or like you have a lightsaber combo that you spend 6 months on and you snap it. That's the level of win that is. Hmm. Another thing that's important to remember when facilitating, pauses. Pauses matter. Don't think that you need to be, don't think that people need to be talking the entire time. It helps and it makes your life better, but sometimes when you're facilitating, something will be said that is so yikesy or impressive or something that you just have to stop. What you do after that, that's on you. But it's happened to me. It will probably happen to you. Now, I'm at the halfway point. Um, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but before I do, does anyone have any questions in regards to how to facilitate itself? Like the thing, like the thing that you would want to do. And feel free to unmute. Everybody's super polite, so go nuts. Nothing heard. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to get the remainder. And again, this is part of going on the fly. So I'm a big Dune fan, and one of the things they said in Dune is that Paul had a small number of people, like 5 or 10. He tr he trained them in his sound magic, totally not the Force. Um, and then his request was they were going to train everybody else. So there's about 4 or 5 of us here. The next step is how do you teach other people to do this? Start with the virtues. As I'm sure you noticed, I can convey the skills of how to do this in less than an hour. The skills are the easy part. The virtues are what makes it hard. So I would say if you're trying to convey this skill to somebody else, start with that. Start with listening. Start with, and then once they have listening down and that they can listen to something, even challenging things, and not strike back and not, react, then they have mastered that first virtue. The second thing is equanimity. In my opinion, equanimity is probably going to be your biggest challenge because you have masters, because you have knights, because you have heads of orders. The instinct for anyone is that when they see someone with a title is to defer to them. When they see someone who is a published author, they defer to them. That, when you are facilitating, is not good. That is actually a vice. Now, there are 2 ways you can look at resolving this. If you are more cynical, then you would bring the regard of masters down to knights, normal knights, non-members, what have you. It could, in theory, be effective, but I recommend against it because you can get in a sort of self-reinforcing, cynical snowball. The other way to do it is look at how masters are treated and then bring everyone else up so that you're looking at it with a compassionate equanimity. So instead of less respect, you're creating more respect. And that will make it where, and so if you're holding everyone in that equal regard, that makes it where more voices can be heard. And it makes it where everyone can feel more comfortable in your session. But, and this is important, there's always that temptation because to bring everyone down to the common level as opposed to lifting people up. Why? Because it's easy. It's easy to tear people down. It's easy to say, well, everybody's not fantastic, so we have to treat everybody as not great. You're always going to be tempted to do that. Or at least I'm always tempted to do that. And with that in mind, I would recommend that you focus on the positive equanimity. And once you get those 2 things in line, that's when you start with the practicum. You give them what necessary skills you have. or what they need, what I've gone over in the first half hour. Then from there, have them do it. Make sure all you need are two people, and have your student work with those two people. And this is where it's going to get a little bit intense on them. It's going to be hard. Find random topics that you know they can talk about. Mentorship. What is the Force? What's the deal with the Sith anyway? You know, things you think people will be able to talk about comfortably. And once you have them comfortable with that, then start working at the edge cases. If you know that there are people within the community that this person is a little bit intimidated by, pull them into a session. And they may be intimidated at first, they may be challenged, but that's fine. Because remember, the practicum portion is your crucible. It's where the skills and the virtues are united in the practice. And then once you get to the point where they're past people who are intimidated, that sort of thing, and this is if you really want them to be good, try to give them a base level education of navigating things like privilege and things like that. And at least in my experience, that's once they start working with that and understanding how privilege and things like that works into what they're doing, you're real close to having somebody who's ready to facilitate. And once they've got that and they know, okay, I need to give this person more space and this person maybe a little bit less, then your final step is to get them something to facilitate in front of the wider community. And once they pass that, congratulations, you have yourself a facilitator. In my experience, if it's something, once you're practiced at it, you can probably have it done. The shortest I've been able to teach people to facilitate from nothing to giving classes, like 3 weeks. But that's if the person is ready. If someone is impatient, if someone feels the need to be heard all the time, it's going to take longer. But that's because, you have a lot more virtue to train, which goes into the last thing. Some people are naturally inclined towards facilitating. When you find those people, train them as soon as possible. Because, again, because the virtues to some extent don't cooperate all the time, people who have a natural knack for it are not super common. So, and that, with 17 minutes to spare, that is the material I have. So, I've said a lot, probably more than I should. Ladies and gentlemen, you have said a great deal, and it is all excellent. So, for those who want to talk, feel free to unmute with any questions, concerns, comments, primal screams of anguish. Please, thank you. Please let me know before you do that. Thanks for that. So yes, the floor is yours for the next 17 minutes.
I really like that class. Thank you for that. I'm sorry. Usually I'm a lot more talkative, but I'm not feeling it.
But here's the thing. The fact that you didn't talk a lot means you probably have great potential to be a facilitator. Because that's
Yeah,
part
I
of
don't
it.
know about that. I do a lot of talking.
Whatever. You ran like a whole class, girl,
Uh.
or a whole like thing where you were doing the Jedi Compass and you facilitated that. No.
Yeah, that's
You facilitate conversations all the time when you're doing your work.
Agreed. Primal screams of anguish. That's so funny.
Hey, listen.
So,
Yes.
No, go ahead and say what you were going to say first.
So yeah, I have facilitated things where people have very, very strong reactions.
I do that all the time. I once tried to hold a meeting and said something so triggering that the child went up to the wall and started bashing their head up against the wall. Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah,
That was horrible.
yeah,
Oops.
yeah.
Clinical
I
hold.
didn't know that the person had a trauma associated with emergency personnel. So when I asked the question, what would you do if there was an emergency it triggered?
Mm-hmm.
So now I ask if
Mm-hmm.
there's anything that, any sensitive information that might upset someone, it would be very handy to know that.
I mean, a yikesy way to learn an important lesson, but it is a very important lesson.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah, and
it's unfortunate, but that was something that I had to learn with experience. That was not something that someone could have told me was going to happen.
mhm,
And even if they did, it probably wouldn't have that bold of effect on me.
absolutely. But
Yeah.
to me, that goes to show another thing that I didn't go into too deeply is that part of being a good facilitator is being approachable. If if someone feels like they can't come up to you and say, listen, I need you to not bug me about talking today, or I need you to be careful about blah, blah, blah. If people aren't comfortable approaching you and saying stuff like that, then you will not be the facilitator that you can be. Like your skill, you will not be at your peak because as you yourself observed, Sarah, people have things in their head that we need to know to be good facilitators. And the more we can get out of their head, then the better our facilitating is going to be. And with that, our cats are bugging us to get fed. So, are there any questions, concerns, anything like that? Or can we stop recording and I can stop my cat from screaming at us until 2 a.m.?
Sounds like a plan.
Meow.
Yes, yes, exactly, Meadow.
Feed me.